Hey there. So today we're going to be talking about Kate Millett's essay, Women, Homosexuals, and Youth, Latent Sexual Liberation. I think this is a really interesting essay that made me really uncomfortable when I first read it, but when you actually get into the content of the essay and you get past what appears to be some very egregiously sinister thoughts, is actually a very interesting discussion about what do liberation movements look like and what is the order of operations, so to speak. And this essay is appearing in Hatred of Capitalism, published by Semiotext. And it's an interview between Kate Millet and Mark Blasius. Mark Blasius is a professor at the City University of New York in political science, and Kate Millet herself is an important feminist philosopher, important in second wave feminism, and she's putting forth looking at the sexual liberation of children. This may sound a little striking when you first hear it, almost like when Freud talks about children having a libido or a sexuality or a sexual drive. But really, what is being laid out here is a very libertarian approach to life, that we should be able to experiment and have control of our actions, provided they are not impeding on another's rights. So provided they are not providing corporeal kind of bodily harm, or provided they are not interfering with the general well-being of society. And part of the feminist movement is about breaking out of these presuppositions about how men and women ought to interact with one another. And there's a large historical project that goes behind looking at the way women have been treated throughout history and saying, okay, there is a patriarchal order to society that has been created and substantiated and ensured by a number of state apparatuses. And the question is, how can we liberate women from these oppressive positions such that they can start to express themselves? But not only that, but what is the order in which this should be done, such that liberation will be genuine and not just de jure? And when she opens up, she's talking about a sexual revolution beginning with the emancipation of women and being emancipated from the standard family structure that's going to say the women must stay at home and, be good homemakers and come and hug and kiss the husband whenever he comes home from his back-breaking job. And getting out of this family structure also involves liberating children to their own sexual lives and ensuring that children can be relinquished from a totalizing control. She says children have virtually no rights guaranteed by law in our society. And besides, they have no money, which, in a money economy, is one of the most important sources of their oppression. Certainly, one of children's essential rights is to express themselves sexually, probably primarily with each other, but with adults as well. Now, this may sound very alarming, but she immediately goes on to problematize this a little, because we think about this binary opposition between children and adults being the divide between minors and not minors, right? There's an age in which one is no longer a minor and thus, can engage in sexual acts as they please, can, incur a number of other responsibilities. But it's interesting when we think about the fact that this age of consent, for example, or, because the age of consent is not necessarily the same as when you no longer become a minor, but these ages are different depending on the society, which I think is a testament to the fact that it is a rather arbitrary line that is being drawn. Now, certainly there's a large intuitive drive behind such a line being placed. We feel a sense of uneasiness when an adult interacts with a minor in a sexual way, especially if this is a really old adult and a really young minor. And we have to ask ourselves the uncomfortable question of why this is the case. And this is exactly what Kate Millet does when she goes on to talk about how we actually bring about this liberation where children can express themselves sexually. Because if we think about the difference between good and bad sexual encounters, it's clear to see that, even someone who is homophobic, for example, would say that a fundamental thing we can agree on is that if sexual contact is non-consensual or it is resulting in severe bodily harm, that this is probably not a good sexual act. So it seems that we could problematize this and say, well, if children are engaged consensually and without coercion and in a healthy manner with someone who is not a minor, what's the problem with this? Now, there are all sorts of virtue questions that will come up about, oh, it's just wrong to have sexual intercourse with a minor as an adult. But it seems very weird when we get to these really strange examples where, for example, a 17 and an 18-year-old are in a society where the cutoff between being a minor and not is 18, and they have sexual intercourse with each other, and there's certainly not as much of an aversion to this minor and not minor having sexual intercourse than, say, an 8-year-old and a 45-year-old. And it is important to realize that there is a substantive difference here in the appeal to pathos, so to speak. That when we see the 17 and 18-year-old interacting sexually, many of us will probably say with confidence that, well, they're just experimenting sexually with each other. I mean, heck, they're probably in the same grade in school together. They're pretty similar in maturity. You'll be hard-pressed to find a year gap where so much change is going to happen across the board for all people that, oh, there's this clear divide where one is no longer a minor. No, it's obvious that we had to draw the line somewhere, so we drew it there. But often, as is the case with feminist philosophers, they draw our attention to these edge cases to ask us why exactly we draw the lines where we do. And Millett introduces the problem with just the straight up sexual liberation of children when she says the problem here is that when you have an exploitative situation between adults and children, as you have between men and women, cross-generational relationships take place in a situation of inequality. Children are in a very precarious situation when they enter into relationships with adults, not only in a concrete material sense, but emotionally as well, because their personhood is not acknowledged in our society. So, hinging off of some of the ideas of women being neglected in society, in being forced into this binary role where they are subservient to the needs of men, in a similar way that women have had issues with becoming liberated sexually because they are still in a position where they can be exploited. It is a similar case with children where we could say, okay, let's just let anybody have sex with whoever they want. But, I mean, Mark here gets us on our way when he asks, do you think that a tender, loving, erotic relationship can exist between a boy and a man? And Millett says, of course, or between a female child and an older woman. Men and women have loved each other for millennia, as have people of different races. What I'm concerned about is the iniquitous context within which these relationships must exist. Of course, these relationships can be non-exploitative, and considering the circumstances, they are probably heroic and very wonderful, but we have to admit that they can be exploitative as well, like in the prostitution of youth. So Millett is drawing our attention to the fact that de jure equality doesn't equal material equality in the ways in which people live their lives. If there is a straight shot instead of traveling a continuum of liberation, if we go straight from an extremely repressive place where children have virtually no rights de jure to a point where all age of consent laws are gone, there is no kind of age of accountability, so to speak. It's just anyone do whatever they want sexually. Obviously, this is going to merely open up the floodgates for material inequalities to be able to express themselves unimpeded. And Mark Blasius continues questioning in a similar line to how we've already been doing, and asks, don't you think that the age of consent laws are barriers to exploring possibilities for non-exploitative cross-generational relationships? And more importantly, serve to further deny the rights of youths to sexual expression? And Kate points out here that originally these laws were meant to protect children from exploitation. But the problem is that as this discourse has developed and there's been this talk about liberation of children sexually, it's been approached more so as the right of men to have sex with kids below the age of consent, and no mention is made of relationships between women and girls. She says, it seems as though the principal spokespeople are older men and not youths. And this is a problem with liberation movements in general, is that when someone doesn't have a voice and there becomes a tendency for other groups to speak on their behalf, it can often appear as though liberation is happening when in actuality it's a form of exploitation. When children can't speak for themselves, a vocal group can arise, like older men, who seek to exploit children and will use this as an out to appear like they are making a revolutionary step. But in actuality, they are merely taking advantage of the optics of liberation. And this is where we're going to start to delve into a little bit the differences between equality and equity. What is the difference between this de jure sense of equality and this genuine sense of acknowledging the material conditions and the social conditions in which people are already in, and thereafter starting from those in an attempt to reach a sort of equity? And Mark says that this is because children and youths don't have a political voice, but points out that most gay male youth groups are supporting a lowering or an abolition of the age of consent as their first step. And he asks, how prevalent are erotic relationships between women and girls, do you think? Because Kate had just pointed out that usually the optics of the sexual liberation of children is between older men and younger boys, and women are often neglected in this situation. And she says that usually in sexual relations, as we're going on here, she states that women tend to have a little bit more freedom than men with regards to these cross-generational loves, that women are generally encouraged to be a little bit maternal towards each other, and, you know, for example, she doesn't mention this, but things like hugging are more commonplace, and, you know, going in the bathroom with each other and things like this at school. There's these little things in which women are encouraged to access that part of themselves, whereas men are told that that is not necessarily where they should be lying. She mentions that there is a lot of cross-generational contact between older women and younger women, but it's often more of like a mentor relationship or a friendship, and it's not necessarily, it doesn't as often cross this line to where it becomes intimate or erotic. She mentions also that women are probably more protective of children. She says also, having been exploited, we are more sensitive to the possibility of exploitation. We've been minors all of our history. So she's acknowledging that, in a sense, women may be a little bit more attuned to the optics versus the reality of liberation, and saying, okay, we care for children, and maybe women will err a little bit more on the side of caution when it comes to this idea of liberation of children. She also states, as a reason for why this sexual liberation of children isn't often being invoked on women's behalf, is that women are often more sexually repressed than men, and they've been given a stricter social code of how they ought to act sexually. I mean, you think of the very traditional sort of idea that sexual intercourse is only reproductive, it's not meant to be pleasurable, and if it is meant to be pleasurable, it's only for the man, and the woman's job is just to please the man sexually. She also mentions that lesbians have had to go through a lot more conditioning, so to speak, as they've gone on their own liberation movement, that maybe they feel a little bit kind of like they're backed into a hole, and that this isn't a step that can be taken in the lesbian liberation movement at the time, that gay relationships among men have been a little bit more prominent throughout history, especially in the clerical situation, and that because lesbian relationships are coming on the scene a little bit later, that maybe this might explain why the discourse on the sexual liberation of children is dominated by men. But she mentions that there's generally a lack of effort that is donned by lesbians in terms of converting this kind of mentor relationship between women generationally into a more erotic one, because maybe there's more complications socially in doing so. Millett says we have to have an emancipation proclamation for children. What is really at issue is children's rights, and not, as it has been formulated up to now, as merely the right of sexual access to children. And I think that's a really interesting distinction that's being made between the optics of liberation can often hinge on this strange divide between exploitation and liberation. And oftentimes this is levied in, for example, the discourse on transgenderism today, or transgender people, not to turn it into an ism. Opponents of transgendered persons as legitimate people will often say that, transgender people are groomers or whatever, because they are usually fighting for the sexual liberation of their fellow transgendered people. And we can see Kate doing a similar thing here, where she's pointing out that there is a difference between the sexual liberation of children done on their behalf as an extension of their agency, and the sexual access to or exploitation of children, insofar as it is a spear donned by those who already oppress children and can use the optics of liberation to actually continue to oppress them. So it seems here that Kate is pushing back a little bit on the notion of the immediate sexual liberation of children. She pointed out at the beginning that it was an important horizon to keep our eyes on, but she's here problematizing our order of operations And Mark questions, but shouldn't one of the rights of children be that of choosing to have an erotic relationship with an older person? And Kate responds, oh, sure, part of a free society would be that you could choose whomever you fancied, and children should be able to freely choose as well. But it's very hard to be free if you have no rights about anything. If you're subjected to endless violence, both physical and psychological, if you're already governed by a whole state system which demands that you put in forced attendance in school whenever you want to be there or not, whether you want to be there or not, I would think that given the conditions under which you're a young person in the society, many things would be at least as important to you as sexuality. And I really like this nuance that's being added here, because one of the things I've always found appealing about feminist theory is that issues surrounding gender and sexuality and liberation, liberation is not just a gender-specific or sex-specific idea. It extends to politics and life more generally, and it's going to extend into a number of ethical ideas, but also into a number of ontological questions about how does identity come about, how is it structured, how is it enforced, how is it repressed. And here Kate is highlighting that this liberation of children, it's not just a sexual liberation. There are other aspects to living a free life that need to be addressed. And part of the problem is not having rights, being subject to all kind of violence by, abusive parents and things like this, or an abusive state apparatus that isn't really going to maybe give students the option to have flexibility in their education or things like this. So she says that, yeah, the sexual liberation might be nice, but it might be a little bit more of optics in the way it's been framed so far, and that maybe there are other things that need to be addressed first to ensure that children have a greater degree of autonomy in a number of different fields that's going to facilitate that sexual liberation actually being able to mean something, actually being a way in which consent can be genuinely given, in which children have the voice in order to have their consent be bolstered by their own community. Now, Mark, and I think, some people reading this might be like, geez, Mark, what kind of person are you? But he says, it strikes me that there is a contradiction in supporting children's liberation while maintaining paternalistic age of consent laws and stigmatizing adults who have erotic relations with young people. And Kate responds, if you don't change all social condition of children, you still have an inescapable inequality. That's like the story of the 1917 revolution. 1917 speaking, of course, to the Bolsheviks in Russia. Men and women were declared equal one morning, and everybody could divorce each other by postcard. It's just that the women had the babies, and getting divorced by postcard when you've been given no means to earn a living and no education, and you're in an enormously inferior economic situation, meant that you were only being declared unequal while not being given the substance of equality. And that idea of the substance of equality is so important. The substance of equality is having a political voice such that you can bolster your sense of autonomy, not just as something that has been given to you, but as something that you can enact and something that can go all the way up the state apparatus and insert itself at different points. And this kind of hinges on, for example, the equality versus equity distinction that's often made in affirmative action discussions today. That there is a difference between saying people are equal and actually having them be equal. When we're in an affirmative action situation and we say, well, taking race into account is racist, and racism is just bad. It's like, no. First off, that's not necessarily racism. Discriminating on behalf of race in the sense of literally what the word discriminate means, to isolate something on behalf of some quality, It can be good if it is done for the benefit of the lesser, kind of like John Rawls puts it in his ethical theories. And in this situation, with regards to the social conditions of children, even if you get rid of these age of consent laws and you quote-unquote give them their autonomy or their freedom, it's less giving them freedom than giving them the reins to be subjugated under a number of people who have oppressive positions over top of them. And thus, regardless of someone's existence de jure, if they did not exist, and if they do not exist currently in a situation in which they can genuinely levy things like consent and freedom and autonomy relatively free of coercion, then there is no genuine liberation there at all. And thus, this is calling us to observe a number of other factors that are going to influence what a liberation movement actually looks like. She finishes off by saying, but what is our freedom fight about? Is it about the liberation of children or just having sex with them? I would like to see a broader movement involving young people who would be making the decisions because it's their issue and their fight. Theirs is the authentic voice. So I think this is exactly the purpose of what feminist philosophy and politics should be about. It is about hearing these subaltern voices, learning how to make spaces for these voices, literally and metaphorically, in a way where freedom is a fight not given to someone on a silver platter, but rather something which one dawns. Because is it really freedom if it has to be bestowed by some state apparatus instead of something that makes the state apparatus shrink in terror? It's like when V says in V for Vendetta, people should not be afraid of their governments, governments should be afraid of their people. That agency is something that is dawned and shown through action, through the way in which it resists totalization. And I think this call to shift the locus of this freedom fight and this call for liberation is something that can be relegated to a number of other discourses and serve us in potentially ensuring the freedom of marginalized communities. So I hope this has been helpful, and leave any comments or constructive or non-constructive criticism in the comments, and I'll see you in another lecture.